To the poetic people of the Ganges, the immense plains of India, the broad and voiceless rivers, the magic beauty of an oasis, the distant silence of the Himalayas, the brooding calm of the atmosphere, all appear to labor in unison to the same end, to fashion the restless heart of mortals after their own emotionless image, to expand it into that fullness of peace which is theirs, and to guide the children of men into the haven where they would be. This mode of thought, or no thought, this complete abandonment of self, culminating in the ascetic, to the desire of union with the infinite, can be differentiated from the meditative pose of the Christian by the absence in it of anything approaching to emotion or affection. These are weaknesses to be set aside. There can be no calm where sensations enter, not even a breath of divine love must stir the ocean of the pictured rest. Gautama fully recognized that true joy was only to be found when the notion of selfhood was in abeyance, as it most certainly is found invariably in those cases in which we lose, as it were, the sense of objective being in an absorbing subject, or in the presence of a fascinating personality. There is an indescribable pleasure realizable in engrossing occupations of mind and body which distract attention from ourselves as selves. Hence the apotheosis of love as the ultimate possible bliss, whether it be manifested in the adoration of the human or in the ecstasy of the saint. Charles Baudelaire declares the whole aim of life is to dispel ennui, the ennui of sitting still by walking, of lying down by change to an erect posture, and so on. Virtue, vice, love, etc., are all efforts to attain a state of oblivion of our individuality, to s'enivrer with distractions of some sort or another. Sorrow is the realization of ourselves as separate entities. The Buddhists declare that, when we rid ourselves of the idea of this separateness, then, and then only, will true joy be found. The same truth is expressed in the New Testament. He that loseth his life shall gain it. The drooping head upon the cross, the livid corpse of the Savior, such pictures are strikingly emblematic of the sacrifice of selfhood, which is ever the cause of pain. Selfhood crucified, that is the great deliverance, that is heaven, that is nirvana. We must do more than take up the cross and follow. We must hang upon it, be nailed to it, if we would be saved. It has been urged that the foundations of Buddhism rest upon the assumption that life is not worth living. Everything leads to pain and sorrow. The joys of life are ignored. Hence, if it were proved that the enjoyments of life outweigh the sorrows, would it not be clearly shown that Buddhism is de trop? For it is clear that life, in that case, would be worth living. This view of life is not only supported by a general consensus of opinion, but seems to be additionally strengthened by the universal desire to live. That this desire would not exist if the pessimistic idea of Buddhism regarding existence were well founded is evident. In opposition to this view, my conception of Buddhism, as represented in its literature, is that its foundations rest upon the assumption that there is a life more worth living, in which all sorrow is eradicated. That only ignorance leads to pain and sorrow. That knowledge leads to their extinction. I am not aware that the joys of life are wholly ignored by Buddhists. If it is granted that happiness predominates over unhappiness, and that life must consequently be worth living, this need not exclude the desire for a life more worth living, in which there is no unhappiness. If Buddhism is the wretched, pessimistic system it is declared by some to be, why should it not be allowed to hypothecate a heaven, when even the joyous, optimistic Christian, who finds life so worth living, speaks of being delivered from the misery of this sinful world, and hopes for a life worth living? Quite 3/4 of the population of this planet, as represented by its religious beliefs, which is supposed to find life worth living, looks through the spectacles of faith towards a life more worth living, after the dissolution of the body. In short, there are two distinct lives recognized by Buddhists, the living life and the non-living life. And it goes without saying that the latter is by far the more desirable of the two. Not the life of men's veins, not of flesh that conceives, but the grace that remains, the fair beauty that cleaves to the life of the rains in the grasses, the life of the dews on the leaves. Dr. Paul Carus says, the good tidings of Buddha's religion are not so much the recognition of the existence of pain and care as the conquest of evil and the escape from suffering. The following verses from the Dhammapada have no pessimistic ring. Let us live happily, then, not hating those who hate us. Among men who hate us, let us dwell free from hatred. Let us live happily, then, free from ailments among the ailing. Among men who are ailing, let us dwell free from ailments. Let us live happily, then, free from greed among the greedy. Among men who are greedy, let us dwell free from greed. There are many passages to be found in the New Testament, in our Christian liturgy, and especially in the hymnology of the churches, which emphasize suffering as the normal and inevitable condition of humanity, almost leading one to suppose that it is the predominant factor in human life. In the burial service we thank God that our brother has been delivered from the miseries of a sinful world, and Job is brought into requisition to show that man that is born of woman is full of sorrows. In a beautiful hymn we have the following verse. If I find him, if I follow. What his guerdon here? Many a sorrow, many a labor, many a tear. For an assembly of young men and maidens in the first rapturous dawn of maturing youth to sing. O paradise, 'tis weary waiting here. Though delightfully pessimistic, does not seem quite up to the standard of absolute truth. These sorrows, these labors, these tears, this weary waiting, represent the experiences in store for the initiate, and the conditions under which the Christian must progress who would reach the goal of his dearest aspirations. Death is self-surrender. All loss is a kind of death. The only begotten Son is the summing up of what is dearest, most one's own, i.e. God can only be at one with his work, can only make it to be truly his work by eternally dying, sacrificing what is dearest to him. God does not, therefore, cease to be, he does not annihilate himself. He lives eternally in the very process of sacrificing his dearest work. Hence God is said to be love. For love is the consciousness of survival in the act of self-surrender. Such would be the atonement of the world, God eternally living in his own death, eternally losing, and eternally returning to himself. Nettleship. It cannot be denied that suffering was the burden of Gautama's song, the refrain of his passionless, yet beautiful, utterances. Jesus has been described as a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. Jesus wept. The whole creation weeps. What think ye, my disciples? The perfect one said, whether is more, the water which is in the four great oceans, or the tears which have flown from you, and have been shed by you, while ye strayed and wandered in this long pilgrimage, and sorrowed and wept because that was your portion which ye abhorred, and that which ye loved was not your portion. And while ye experienced this through long ages, more tears have flown from you, and have been shed by you, while ye strayed and wandered on this long pilgrimage, and sorrowed and wept because that was your portion which ye abhorred, and that which ye loved was not your portion, than all the water which is in the four great oceans. Oldenburg's Buddhism. Saint Paul conjures up a vision of the immense figure of creation, prostrate, groaning beneath the silent heavens. The true Buddhist certainly sees in this world a state of continuous sorrow. But this sorrow only awakes in him a feeling of compassion for those who are yet in the world. For himself he feels no sorrow or compassion. He seeks nirvana with the same joyous sense of victory in prospect with which the Christian looks forward to his goal, everlasting life. Oldenburg. The doctrine of an irrevocable doom for the unbeliever and obdurate sinner is not easy to follow, because it would seem to imply a failure of the redemptive work of the Savior unless all for whom he died ultimately partake of salvation. If many are called and but few are chosen. If the gate is narrow, and only a microscopic minority enter thereby, the supreme sacrifice of the only begotten Son of God is liable to lose significance in the eyes of an exigent public. Jesus treated popular religious terms such as hell and heaven as symbols. He employed the familiar images of heaven and hell to impress on men's consciousness the supreme bliss of righteousness and the awful misery of sin. When our Lord came, he found the doctrines of last things presented in forms already fixed, and the terms Gehenna, paradise, etc., in familiar, even proverbial, use. Eschatology, Encyclopaedia Britannica. Every being, according to Buddhistic teaching, attains nirvana in the end. So may it not be in the times of the restitution of all things, which God hath spoken by the mouth of all his holy prophets since the world began. If symbolism were only taken for what it represents, every Buddhist could join with the Christian in many of the exquisite invocations of the Psalms. There is no rest to be found in the impermanent. To find the peace which passeth understanding, we must ultimately have recourse to the unconditioned, the permanent, nirvana, God. The prayer of the Christian as well as the aspiration of the pure Buddhist is to be, whether living or dead, one with the uncreate. Professor Oldenburg says that, the devotion of abstraction is to Buddhism what prayer is to other religions. There is here a distinction without a difference. Abstraction is nothing more nor less than true, perfect, sublimated prayer. Real, unadulterated prayer is only possible when the mind is totally relieved of distractions. Jesus went apart to pray. So the Buddhist monk seeks the silence of the forest or the seclusion of the cave to commune with the unconditioned, with Our Father which art in heaven. With the uncreate of the Athanasian Creed. He who abstracts himself from the plurality of the phenomenal world anticipates the cessation of the impermanent. Come, then. Into solitude will I go, into the forest which Buddha praises. Therein it is good for the solitary monk to dwell who seeks perfection. In the cedar forest rich in blossoms, in the cool mountain cave will I wash my body and walk alone. The counting of inhalations and exhalations of the breath, and other practices of a like nature, are used as so many shortcuts to this state of abstraction or prayer. For this purpose they are as valuable as ceremonial magic professes to be for the ready acquisition of power over unknown laws and qualities of nature. Christianity and Buddhism cannot be differentiated in this matter of abstraction. Gibbon writes, the fakirs of India and the monks of the Oriental Church were alike persuaded that, in total abstraction of the faculties of the mind and body, the purer spirit may ascend to the enjoyment and vision of the deity. The opinion and practice of the monasteries of Mount Athos will be best represented in the words of an abbot who flourished in the 11th century. When thou art alone in thy cell, says the ascetic teacher, shut thy door, and seat thyself in a corner. Raise thy mind above all things vain and transitory. Recline thy beard and chin on thy breast. Turn thy eyes and thy thoughts towards the middle of thy belly, the region of the navel, and search the place of the heart, the seat of the soul. At first all will be dark and comfortless. But, if you persevere day and night, you will feel an ineffable joy. And no sooner has the soul discovered the place of the heart than it is involved in a mystic and ethereal light. Here, in these practices attributed to Christian saints, we have an exact parallel to those in use by Hindu ascetics even of the present day. It must be clearly understood, however, that the Buddhist attaches no merit to such practices, unless they conduce to the banishment of ignorance. Asceticism, as a thing in itself, is useless. Heaven and nirvana are unpainted pictures, undescribed actualizations. They are realities, not materialities. There is a never-ending, unsatisfied, restless craving, conscious or unconscious, throughout the cosmos to enter upon reality. The suns and the satellites whirl about aimlessly in search of it. The whole universe is in sore trouble because, through ignorance, it is not. The vulture's eye hath not seen it. The lion's whelps have not trodden it, nor the fierce lion passed by it. The depth saith, it is not in me. And the sea saith, it is not with me. And yet it is there. The use of such exaggerated terms as immense, infinite, illimitable, etc., is to be accounted for by referring the habit to unconscious efforts by the conditioned to express the unconditioned. The sea, mountains, the heavens, owe the fascination to a suggestion of the unconditioned possessed by them. In moments of attempted aspiration we are prone to look upwards into space, a symbol of the boundless. On the other hand, when the mind is engaged in working out details and calculations, there is the habit of looking downwards. Not only men, but beasts of the field, look upwards for help in the dying moments. Upwards into space, where the conditioned seemingly vanishes into the unconditioned. I have often witnessed the pleading expression of dying antelopes and other wild animals, their eyes being almost invariably directed to the sky above in the last moments of life. I was on one occasion more than usually struck with this beautiful expression, appealing, as it were, to the skies for mercy, in the case of a wounded bear when in its death throes amid the snowy solitudes of the Himalayas. Let us draw the curtains apart, and behold for a moment the scene of the enacted tragedy. Out of the violet mist spread by the viewless hands of a yet unrisen sun, black crags uplifted the glacier breasts to receive the first ravishing kiss of dawn. And the forests, obedient to the silence imposed by the kingly peaks, stood austere and unstirred by the affectionate airs of heaven. The staining blood, the furry mask, the clutching claws of the wild monster in his struggle with life and death, presented to the imagination some weird sacrifice consummated upon an altar, built of immaculate snow. It was then that this remarkable pleading expression of the eyes arrested the attention of my Himalayan huntsman, who, turning round to me, exclaimed, "He is seeing God." The psalmist says, "I will lift up mine eyes to the hills, from whence cometh my help." Human beings, as well as all animal nature, seem to make the final appeal for help a pity to something above or beyond this conditioned world. The enhancement of the beauties of landscape and architecture by the effects of mist and twilight is due to the obliteration of detail by these atmospheric conditions. Detail is fatiguing to the eye and brain. These organs unconsciously demand the repose which the absence of detail confers. Hence the charm of Impressionism in art. In the countenances of the blind, who possess one sensation the less to distract and weary them, there is not infrequently to be noticed a peculiar scintillation of peace which seems to speak to one of the time when all sensations will cease to be, and to herald the approach of that eternal beatitude which is so highly uplifted above the joys of this transitory world. There is also a strong Nirvanic suggestion in the appearance of some of the eminent ecclesiastics of the Roman Catholic faith, in those instances where the flesh shows traces of the consuming fire of asceticism. Benevolence, compassion, love, genius, joy, all these are presented, but with a minimum of the earthy adhering to them. In this aspect they create an impression very different to that communicated to us by the comfortable placidity of those who have only experienced happiness of a less exalted description. As in stillness, another attribute of the unconditioned, there abides an enchantment that cannot be surpassed by other conditions. Yet even the rapture engendered by the sight of a furious and incontinent sea can be explained by the fact that the pleasure derived therefrom is solely due and in proportion to the magnitude of the display, and magnitude suggests the illimitable. The ambition to scale the highest summits, in whatever position or capacity, the idea of resurrection, the fascination of the word eternal, the hope of everlasting rest, all these tend in the same direction, all point to the Empyrean, where detail seems to fade into a vacuum, into nirvana, into heaven, into God. Chapter 5. Some concluding remarks. It is only when we come to take a bird's-eye view of these two great religions, which have exercised so enormous and so abiding an influence over the human race, and when clearness of vision is unobscured by numberless petty details and dogmas, that we can perceive the factors common to both which have given them the present stability and strength. No religion, no system of morals, no philosophy, can be secure unless they rest upon the groundwork of universal truth and necessity. And it is certain that, if Christianity and Buddhism did not possess these supports, they would not now be what they actually are, the ruling forces to millions of human beings. It has been said with much truth that the daily life of an ordinary man is a continual round of intoxication. Some form or other of inebriating excitement seems absolutely necessary to him, if he is to escape from the slough of despond of ennui and all its evil consequences. The remark is equally true of the human race as a whole. It cannot survive, apparently, without constant stimuli to urge and goad it forward. Were such stimuli wanting from time to time, man would probably degenerate, and cease to show that love of progress and activity which is so essential to his existence as man. Consequently, we note, looking back through the vista of history which lies open to our view, the periodical appearance of some great religious reformer, whose task it is to infuse new zeal and strength into the flagging energies of his fellow creatures. Gautama, Jesus, Savonarola, General Booth, are all greater or lesser instances in point. Have all worked upon the same basic conception, however different the condition of the times may have required the superficial doctrines of the various creeds to be. Some, Jesus and Gautama, and possibly Muhammad, worked with the full cognizance of the task before them. Others, who have not been gifted with so large a measure of divine insight, have wrought and lived for the same purpose, blindly, and unconscious of the complete significance of their action. But, it may be asked, if Jesus and Gautama were gnomic, how comes it that the Buddhism and Christianity of today are so radically different in their outward manifestations? To answer this question we have merely to take a broad glance at history. At the time of the advent of Gautama, the people of India were in possession of a civilization remarkable in many respects, but most remarkable, perhaps, in the freedom and latitude of thought prevalent. It is difficult for many who have been brought up within the contracted influences of those who regard all alien religions and non-Christian countries as so many black spots on the pages of history and on the maps of the world, and who have been surrounded in the youth by the innumerable restrictions placed upon all speculative propensities, to realize that, at the time when they were mere cave dwellers and unclothed sojourners with the beasts of the field, a great and lofty civilization was existent in what they would possibly consider a barbarous corner of the globe, and that a people there held dominion whose chief intellectual pastime was to range over the vast domains of speculative thought and all the interminable mysteries of life. The Indian has been a philosopher by birth and breeding from time immemorial. And only among a race of philosophers could such a religion as Buddhism, with its sudden iconoclasm, have been preached with so little opposition, and have taken root so rapidly, when we come to consider the strong hold the Brahmanical ceremonial had upon the people at that time. With the inception of Christianity, however, the case was very different. At the birth of Jesus, the inhabitants of Palestine, with the exception of the Essenes, were sunk low in the mire of bigotry, prejudice, and priestly domination. The mind of the people was less philosophically prepared to grasp a broad and exalted creed such as essential Christianity. It required dogmas more definite, doctrines more easily comprehended. And Jesus had perforce to mold his utterances to the temperament and mental capacity of the people among whom he preached. To the east of the Holy Land was India, with its refined and more perfect civilization. To the west, Central Europe, with its savage and ignorant tribes, worshippers of trees, and in servitude to many superstitious practices and customs. Christianity, with its immense potential resources, its innate power for good, required some outlet for its activities. And, as was only natural, it spread in the direction where a pure and sublime religion was most needed, and experienced little difficulty in eventually conquering the savage intellect of Central Europe. Becoming appropriated by men who, living in the far north, depended for their very life upon a ceaseless struggle with adverse circumstances, it gradually lost the softening and refining influences which are so characteristic of the Oriental temperament, and became the vehicle for the passions and ambitions of a race more brutal and more unsympathetic than that among which it took its rise. And to what an extent has this religion of Christ, the evangel of peace and goodwill, been since prostituted? The mistaken, though, no doubt, well-intended, dogmas formulated by the Holy Catholic Church proved to be, in the short-sightedness and complete lack of insight into human nature, a prolific source of degeneration, bigotry, persecution, ignorance, immorality, and extreme ecclesiastical tyranny in the Dark Ages. The rigid and narrow doctrines inculcated by the Puritans have been almost as fruitful a cause of moral perversion and reckless narrow-mindedness. Today it must be acknowledged that we have outgrown the gross and debasing Christianity of those medieval times. But many of us are still fast chained in the shackles of prejudice and intolerance, with all the concomitant delusions and hypocrisies. Bruno, in his day, said, "Christianity has been tried for 18 centuries. The religion of Christ remains to be tried." This remark, however, overstates the case considerably, for it must be confessed that there have been many instances of individual lives which have approached as closely to the ideal as far as it has been practicable within human limits. True Christianity many of us have yet to learn. It is but the husk which exists with the many as yet. Nevertheless, we flatter ourselves sometimes as the elect of the earth, and dispatch emissaries of civilization to the darkest corners of heathendom to carry with them only a very imperfect presentment of our great religion in practice and doctrine. It is but lately that stern necessity caused the deserts of the Sudan to be strewn with the corpses of many thousands of dervishes, and the pietist section of the British press rejoiced at the great victory of Christianity over Islam, and the fulfillment of a long-cherished revenge for the most truly Christian of English soldiers. To such an extent can inconsistency flourish among the most morally advanced of the earth's inhabitants. And if Europeans have been zealous in waging war to the death against the heathen in the name of the common religion, they have been no less ready to turn the gospel of peace into an apologia for such an internecine slaughter as few other causes have given rise to, until, at the present day, it is hardly possible to write seriously, in order that they may be taken seriously, the words, "How these Christians love one another." When we turn to India, to Ceylon, and more especially to Burma, we are brought face to face with a very different state of things. It is true that in some parts, Tibet, for instance, Buddhism has been debased to an even worse state than Christianity in Europe. But, after all, that is merely asserting that human nature is human nature. The broader aspect of Buddhism in Asia must, to any unprejudiced observer, appear in striking contrast to the prostitution to which other religions in other corners of the earth have been subjected. It seems to be one of the unalterable laws which govern human conduct that the teaching of any great religious reformer should, in the centuries which follow his disappearance from the arena in which he had striven, be brought low and narrowed down, partly by the short-sightedness of its adherents, but mostly owing to the unhealthy influences of ecclesiastical domination such as was typical of medieval Europe and Brahmanical India. That Buddhism should in great degree have escaped such a fate must be attributed, not only to the intrinsic value of the system itself, but also to the character of the people among whom it has survived. There have been many calumniators, from interested motives, of Buddhism. But no false representations, however frequently reiterated, can serve to mask the purity and nobility of this remarkable religion. It has never, like Christianity, been made the pretext of warfare and the conquest of alien races. No blood has ever been shed in its propagation. No despairing cries of martyred wives and orphan children rise up from the centuries that are past to stamp its forehead with the brand of Cain. By reason alone has it spread and become endeared to the many millions who now owe it allegiance. Reason and truth are the only swords which have been unsheathed in the cause of its promulgation. It has, in fact, conquered by its sweet reasonableness alone, unaided by artificial and compulsory means. The gradually diminishing popularity of the religious war sentiment which actuates people to perpetrate such iniquities as crusades and jihads will, it is presumed, afford relief in the future, at least to some sections of the Christian world, by removing an opportunity out of the way for the reproach of those who take the stand by the non-resistance principle as enunciated by the founder of the Christian faith. The carrying out of the non-resistance principle in its totality seems to increase in impracticability in proportion to the advancing complexity of social and national life. A very near approach to the achievement of the object embodied in the principle can only be imagined possible under the most primitive conditions of existence, notably in such cases where the country inhabited provides the necessities of life without involving any violent struggle for their acquisition. Christian nations, by the force of circumstances and the nature of their environment, are unfortunately impelled, it would seem, to disregard and set aside the very distinct teaching of Jesus on this point. And some of us, facing both ways, endeavor to escape from the dilemma, and pour balm upon our consciences, by assuming that war is amply justified by Scripture and expressly sanctioned by the Almighty. In this connection it would perhaps be the most straightforward course for us to frankly admit with Tolstoy that war is as fundamentally un-Christian as it is un-Buddhistic, and to be prepared to face the consequences of its unlawfulness in the sight of God rather than to dislocate the teaching of Jesus with a view to the selfish satisfaction of our consciences, and for the ultimate purpose of settling down into a comfortable frame of mind when brought into contact with this unpleasant subject. In spite of the many detractors Buddhism has had, it has been appreciated in cultivated centers of Europe and America to an extent which is the surest token of its intrinsic worth. In Asia it is difficult to realize how profound and enduring has been its influence for good. Perhaps, on account of the presence of dogmas, such as the negation of soul as a permanent individual entity and of immortality as it is known among us, which are to the average European intellect absurd and most repugnant, it has been more readily assimilated as a belief by races which, unlike ourselves, are philosophic by nature and by birth. But by far the most important part of Buddhism in its practical significance is the doctrine of karma, which has proved so great a stumbling block to many, and a medium of contempt for those professing other faiths. It would hardly be exaggeration to describe this as one of the grandest ethical theories ever devised by the brain of man, ranging as it does over the whole sphere of human activity and existence, and policing, as it were, the actions of human creatures. Lest it should appear to any of my readers that I have laid undue stress upon the value and beauty of Buddhism in the foregoing pages, I would take this opportunity of disclaiming any intention on my part to draw invidious distinctions between the manifestations of the two faiths of which I have treated, and which, in my opinion, are fundamentally one and the same. In this connection my sole aim has been to give prominence to the many excellent properties possessed by Buddhism, with a view to clearing the way for an impartial appreciation of this religion by those who have never yet bestowed their attention or extended the sympathies to the subject with unbiased minds. The dissolution, not the destruction, of symbolism which I have endeavored to accomplish in dealing with the metaphysic of Christianity and Buddhism, of that symbolism which is so apt, when taken as a thing in itself, to contract our sympathies and darken our vision in respect of religions, will have achieved an object if it succeeds in carrying with it a conviction, at present, so indisturbably possessed by the writer, that essential Christianity and true Buddhism cannot be differentiated. That the ultimate source of the power and loveliness is one. That they rest upon the same imperishable foundations, which are lost to sight in billowy clouds of mystery, in a splendor beyond imagining. The priest in Zola's Rome looked forward to the day when symbols and rites, so necessary in the infancy of the world, would disappear altogether, to the time when enlarged, purified, and instructed humanity would be able to support the brightness of naked truth. Without their assistance. It may be, however, that any premature abandonment of symbols, rites, and ceremonies might, under present conditions, prove disastrous, as such a course would go far to arrest artistic tendencies and stifle within us those cravings for the beautiful which are such undeniably potent and useful factors in conducting us onward to a realization of the invisible. All that appears requisite in this direction at the present moment is that the symbolic element in symbolism should be clearly recognized, and symbolism appraised at its true value. Concurrently with the development of a deeper insight into the realities which subsist in symbols, there should arise in these northern latitudes a class of people who would demonstrate by the character and actions that, under existing social conditions, and in all the turmoil of modern civilization, a nearer approach to the ideal life than has yet been made by a community is within the range of practicalities. This is the most clamant need of the day. In our Western world we are confronted with innumerable obstacles in the way of leading the ideal, or Christ-like, life. The ideal life germ is in all of us, but too often hidden away under the veneer of respectability, and much obscured by conventionalities. This germ, if not very apparent in our public capacity, is distinctly discernible in the family life as typical of these islands. We see it in the eyes of the wife, in the restraint of the son, and we listen to it in the voices of our daughters. It struggles hard to develop itself in the face of stupendous difficulties. Its growth among our spiritual leaders is frequently handicapped by the isolating effects of aggrandizement. A cardinal, for instance, good and gracious as he invariably is, must always be more or less inaccessible and appalling. Our charities, too, are vitiated by ostentation. Prospectuses demand that a royalty should take the lead, and the titled figure as patrons, if the appeal made is designed to be irresistible. So that, to whichever side we turn, we find ourselves hampered in our aspirations towards the ideal by the exigencies of society, by our customs and absurdities. Turning to the Far East, we are face to face with other conditions, which undoubtedly lend themselves more readily to the impress of the ideal. Burma is a country where strikingly successful endeavors continue to be made to hold constantly before the eyes of the people exemplars of the ideal life, and the results are astonishing, approximating a perfection which it is hardly possible to overrate. Notwithstanding the enormous capacity and appreciation its inhabitants possess for the frivolities of existence, they are wont to support out of the slender resources a numerous staff of monks, who are to be found in all parts of the land, and in every place where the fellow creatures congregate in small or large numbers. However far laymen may deviate from the path, the ideal life as exemplified by the monks must not be tampered with. It is the expressed will of the laity that this example should be unremittingly preserved in all its integrity and purity, whatever may be the sum of their own failings. It is this intense admiration and fervor on the part of the lay community for the ideal life, as known to them through the teaching of the Enlightened One, that has secured this incalculable blessing to the people, and made Burma a model for all nations in this respect. There is a sadness unspeakable in the thought that perhaps, ere long, this ancient and ennobling bond between the people and the religious teachers, between the material and the ideal, will be swept away in the wake of commerce and utilitarianism, and all their attendant debasements. Mr. Fielding, in his book The Soul of a People, brings all his unique experiences and intimate knowledge of the Burmese and the monkhood to impress upon us this marvelous object lesson in the effect of a religion whose abiding principles are an ever-present, living force, and of which it may be truly said it is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Everywhere, intermingled with this light-hearted people, delighting in color, dress, and decoration of all kinds, there is ever to be seen the serene and passionless personality of the monk. No reviler of alien creeds. No possessor of priestly power. Poorer than the poorest, yet rich in the inheritance of the Dharma. No figurehead of some illustrious superstition, mighted, and heralded through the streets. Naught, save a lowly follower of the Perfect One, whose law it is that guides to the great peace, which, like a star, beacons from the abode where the eternal are.